Good morning to those who are currently experiencing morning, good afternoon, or perhaps even evening. Don't know how far east we're going at this point. Welcome to our weekly Haftorah Shiur with Dr. Jon Kelsen. Without further ado, let's get learning. Dr. Kelsen, please.
Terrific. Okay, thank you very much, Noah, as always, and thank you for your gracious hosting of this and other shiurim and all you do for Drisha. Good morning to everybody. This week we are continuing our study of the Haftorah of the Shavua, relating it to, or interrogating, asking how it relates to the Parashah. So I see some people might be newer, and some people have been here with us throughout the past couple of weeks of this journey. We continue today with Parashat Chayei Sarah and its Haftorah. Once again, the Haftorah, as like last week, the Haftorah comes from the book of Kings. This time it's from the beginning of the book of Kings. It's from Malachim Aleph, Perek Aleph, the very beginning, First Kings, chapter 1. And we will spend quite a bit of time or focus today looking into the very rich story there and encountering David at the end of his reign, indeed at the end of his life. But first, let's just remind ourselves of what's happening in the Parashah and in the book of Genesis. Last week, and actually what I'll do is I will see if I can pull up the text. This should work. Okay. So I'm just those of you who don't have a Tanakh at home, Parashat Chayei Sarah, Genesis 23. Genesis 22, to remind you, is the lion's share of that chapter is about the Akedah, is about the story of the binding of Isaac, and that accounts for much of the parallel between last week's Parashah Vayera, and the story of Elisha and the resurrected child in Kings from last week's Haftorah, to remind you. By the way, if anyone here happens to be in Israel or knows people who are in Israel, tonight Rabbi David Silber who's in Jerusalem right now, will be teaching on the Akedah at the Ramban Synagogue tonight at 8 p.m. Israel time. So that's just, it should be out on our Facebook pages, but if anybody is interested or knows somebody who might be here, might be interested, please do let them know. 8 p.m. tonight in Jerusalem, live and in person on the Akedah, which Rabbi Silber has, as always, much insight to share. So that's what's happening in Parashat Vayera, and we end at the beginning of Parashat Chayei Sarah. We find that Sarah has lived 127 years and passes away. I remind you again of the Midrash studied by Rashi, which explains the juxtaposition between this chapter right in front of you now and the story of the Akedah, that when Sarah heard of what happened at the Akedah and she nearly lost her son, her soul departed from her. Parcha nishmata, her soul jumped out of her body, and she passed away. And we noted last week how the Haftorah places a much greater emphasis on the story of the mother, which is absent explicitly much of it is absent explicitly in the Akedah story in the Chumash, and perhaps the Haftorah comes to fill in that gap, and perhaps the Midrash, which claims that Sarah dies upon hearing the news of the Akedah, is in some way related to the choice of that Haftorah for last week's Parashah. This week's Parashah, so Sarah dies. She dies in Hebron be'eretz Canaan. Vayavo Avraham lispod l'Sarah v'livkota. And Avram comes to mourn for her and to bewail her. And after doing so, he rises from her me'al pnei meto, an idiom meaning that he has someone he's in mourning for, a relative, and he negotiates, as you may know, the story of her burial plot in what becomes known as Ma'arat HaMachpelah in Hebron. Ger v'toshav anochi imachem, he says, I am but a resident alien living with you. Please give me a burial site and I can bury them. And we know there's a sort of a lengthy back and forth between himself and the Hittites, the Hittite living in the land. And eventually he negotiates with Ephron the Hittite and purchases, again, this is not our topic right now, but back and forth, eventually buys the plot for 400 shekels of silver, Arba Me'ot shekel kesef. He buys the plot and purchases this land, this field. Vayakam Sedeh Ephron Asher Machpelah, and the Ma'ara and everything around it goes to Avram as in Hebron, in Eretz Canaan, as an achuzat kever, which is an important phraseology. They call it here a burial site in the JPS translation, a burial site, but achuzat kever, achuz in the sense of seizing, or that which has been seized, but a plot that now belongs to him. This is an important moment because Abraham is starting to take root in and purchase, this land which he has journeyed to and been promised to him. And there we say goodbye to Sarah, and Abraham buries her with due respect, it appears, and procedure, and is able to secure for her an achuzat kever in the land. Chapter 24 then reads as follows, Avraham Zakein, again, it's on the screen in front of you, or you can read it in your Tanakh, Chumash. Avraham Zakein, Abraham was old, Ba Bayamim, advanced in years. Vadonai Berachat Avraham Bakol, and God had blessed Abraham Bakol, with everything. We have a sense here of Abraham entering into his twilight years, or twilight days perhaps, in abundance, in a sense of perhaps achievement, a sense of blessing. God Beirachat Avram Bakol, with everything that Abraham could have wanted, including importantly, now with a son, Isaac, who shall be his heir. We've talked about Ishmael in previous chapters of the book, and Abraham's relationship with Ishmael. But now his focus and the focus of the narrative is primarily on Isaac. And God has blessed Avram Bakol with an heir, but what he has not provided Abraham with this point, Abraham does not see Isaac's own secured succession, right? That's to say, a wife for Avram. So Avram says to his servant Zikan Beito Hamosher B'chol Ashalo, Simna Yadecha Tachat Yerechi. Avram has his loyal servant. We'll find that his servant is extremely loyal and sets out to do just Abraham's bidding. He says, put your hand under my thigh, sort of a gesture of oath, right? To hold on to some, in terms of rabbinic conceptions, to hold on to sort of a holy object, a place of the milah. Place your hands under my thigh, and I ashbiacha, and I will make you swear, right? I will forswear you by God. Lo tikach isha livnim b'bnot Kanaani asher anochi yoshev b'kerbo. Do not take an inappropriate, right, what he calls an inappropriate wife from my son, from the Canaanites, but rather go back, el artzi ve'el moladati telech, right, the reversal of the lech lecha, when he left his land and his birthplace, and now he goes back. He sends to go back there and go there and take isha livni liyitzchak. Go and take, prominent words in the book. Go and take from my son Isaac a wife from there. And of course, as we may remember, the servant says, what if she doesn't want to come back with me? And should I take him there? Avram says, never. Do not take my son there. This is a one-way trip. There's no return ticket. He stays here. God, Elohei Hashemayim, who took me from that place, right? He will send his malach in front of you. He will take a wife for my son from there, but you're not to bring him back there. And if the woman doesn't want to come back, then v'nikita mishuati zot, you are exempt from this oath. You are clean of this oath. And in short, the servant does swear as such, and much of the rest of the parsha deals with him just sort of scanning through, right? But because we're not reading the parsha in depth right now, but just to remind us of the basic plot line, much of the rest of the parsha deals with the servant's travels and meeting eventually when he gets to a well back by his father's, by Abraham's home cities, Aram Naharayim El Ir Nachor, and he goes to the well. We know this is often a place where what Robert Alter calls type scenes, right, where people encounter by the well. Men and women encounter each other and eventually, sort of the romantic encounter, as we would call it today, occurs, and that's where they find their spouse. And he says, he prays to God, and lo and behold, out comes, as he's speaking, Rivka Yotzeit. She turns out that she is the relative of Isaac's, because she is Abraham's niece, and she is very beautiful. V'hanara tovat mareh ma'od, ish lo yada'a, and no man had known her. And she is a virgin, and goes down to the spring, fills her cup, jar comes up, and etc. And he meets her. She gives him some water to drink. Comes home eventually. The proposal is issued. We meet Lavan, and at the end of the day, she agrees to the proposal. She goes back with him to the land of Canaan, and we meet Isaac eventually, who is coming back from Be'er Lachai Roi. He's coming back from Be'er Lachai Roi. That is actually the site of, according midrashically at least, the site where Hagar, Abraham's, Abraham's former wife, is living. And according to the midrash, he is there. Halach l'havi Hagar la'aram aviv sa'ena. He had gone there, Isaac, in order to convince or to bring back Hagar, Abraham's once wife, to bring her back to Abraham, to be returned to Abraham, that he should remarry her. Again, the end of the Parashah, after Isaac and Rivka are brought together, we hear, and again, remember, Avram is Zakein Ba Bayamim, and God had blessed Avram Bakol, but nonetheless, Abraham, this is chapter 25, Yosef Abraham continued, went on and added a wife, Aikach Isha Shema Keturah. He had married Keturah, and they have, I believe, 6 children. So he has 6 more children at the end of his life, and the Midrash identifies Keturah with Hagar. So along with that Midrashic line, you have actually Isaac himself. Remember Isaac was in Isaac's relationship with Ishmael, but Isaac himself was the one who goes to have Abraham remarry Hagar after his own mother Sarah's death, and Abraham then has more children. I'll explain when we start looking at the Haftorah together why I'm stressing some of these features, including the idea that Avram, at the end of his life, remarries and has 6 new children, and that Isaac actually is involved with, according to the Midrash at least, with orchestrating that remarriage. That becomes important. But here's, that's basically the Parashah. They go back, they meet Isaac, right? For coming back from Be'er Lachai Roi. Isaac brings her into the tent of his mother. Vayive'eha Yitzchak A'ola Sarah Imo. Vayikachet Rivka. Vatihilau lo li'isha. Vaye'aveha. And he takes Rivka, she becomes his wife, and he indeed loves her. Vayinachem Yitzchak Acharei Imo. And Isaac finds comfort. Remember, we heard about comfort when we learned about Noah. Isaac finds comfort after the death of his mother. And here's where Abraham, marries Keturah, and that is where the Parashah basically leads us. Abraham dies, B'Seva Tova, Zakein v'Saveya, Vayasef Elamav. Abraham dies, Vaygva, Vayamat Avram, at a good, ripe old age, and contented, and gathered to his people, and both of his sons bury him. Here comes Ishmael again. Maybe he came along with his mother, or was sort of happy to see his parents reunited, and they bury him in that same me'ara where Sarah is buried, etc. And God then blesses his son, etc., etc. So let me just stop the share for 1 second here. The depiction here of Abraham at the end of his life it's rather it evokes, I'd say, as the verse itself talks about, right? Avram dying is seva tova, contentment, peace, specifically through not only blessing, God is blessing him bakol, so a sense of abundance and blessing, but also or via through clean, secure succession. Right? When you think about, this is both in terms of Abraham, the sort of character, qua just any other, individual, and Avram qua the bearer of the covenant, right? The covenant which is supposed to be, you will become a father of many great Av Hamon Goyim, many descendants. Abraham at the end of his life is, we would have understood if he would be anxious about the possibilities of succession or the challenges of succession. Remember that the son who was promised to him as this will be your heir, right? He almost had to sacrifice him, right? By Alehu la'olah. Maybe he did sacrifice him when he was reborn, according to the Midrashic reading. So Abraham, the fact that Abraham instead is able to end his life b'seva tova, with contentment, with blessing, and with secure succession, is no little thing, both for him as an individual, meaning like any other person among humanity, but especially as Abraham, the bearer, the conveyor, the initiator of the covenant, right, or the first of the forefathers, I should say, right, who is supposed to start off this people, and which shall be a people of blessing, but also, like the stars in the sky and the sands of the sands of the sea, to be such multitudes. Avram able to secure a succession, secure a wife for his son, which hopefully will lead to such a succession, is extremely important for the narrative and sort of brings his story to a peaceful close. This is alongside his ability to bury his wife in I don't know if in peace. I don't know exactly. He's crying for her. He's mourning her. He clearly, is in mourning. But a sense of he's able to secure for her an achuzat kever, despite some of the challenges in doing so in the land. And by doing so, not only does he secure for herself an achuzat kever, and he eventually is buried there, but his people, right, or his family, maybe I should say, are starting to gain a foothold, right, in this land, which he has been sent from his own homeland to live in, and to take hold of. So the story ends peacefully, right? And indeed, we know that in Genesis, and I guess throughout the Tanakh, but in Genesis, we have warring sons, warring brothers, Cain and Abel, all the way down through, in a way, Ishmael and Isaac, certainly Jacob and Esau, and certainly the sons of Jacob, Joseph and his brothers. But here, Abram at least is able to be buried by both of his sons together. So Isaac is the chosen heir, but according to the narrative, but Ishmael is there for the burial, and they bury him together. And Hagar comes back into the picture. And Abraham, it's interesting, Abraham not only is able to secure an heir for his son, Isaac, not only is able to bury his wife, but he is able to sire 6 new kids. He has six new children at the very end of his life, half of 12, right? 6 new children at the end of his life, and then he dies at a ripe old age in blessing. So this is one way. This is the story of Abraham, right, where his children are together at the end of his life, not separate, right? They're together, and he's buried his wife, and he has blessing, and he has new children, and he's content. And this is one picture of mortality, of succession story, and of the end of life. Okay, this is our Parashah. It's one picture. Now, Abraham, by the way, hasn't had a simple life, but by the end, this is what we see. What is the relationship of the Haftorah to the Parashah? That's our meta question, I suppose, for these weeks. And here we'll see Haftorah, which stands in dramatically stark contrast to the story of Abraham. So we'll turn our attention now to another figure, David, the figure of David. And this is the David that we meet at the beginning of the book of Kings. So let me share again, this time from Malachim Aleph, Parak Aleph, right, from 1 Kings chapter 1. And I'll just note, of course, that 1 Kings chapter 1 comes after the end of 2 Samuel, after the book of Samuel. And many have talked about, including Rabbi Silver, but many have talked about the relationship of the end of Samuel to the beginning of the book of Kings, and the picture of David at the end of Samuel to the picture of David at the beginning of Kings. What's interesting is that in that regard, one of the many things that are interesting is that the book of Kings does not begin with the story of the second king, Solomon. That is to say, the book of Samuel doesn't wrap up the story of David completely. At the end of the book of Samuel, if you are familiar, or if not, you can take a look now or go back to it later. We have sort of closing speeches by David, and a closing story of David's census of the people, for which God gets angry at Israel, and David has to sort of repent for. But David has his last words, Eila Divrei David Harachonim, the end of chapter 20, the beginning of chapter 23 of 2 Samuel, of Shmuel Bet. And it's interesting, actually, and this is Michael Fishman points this out in his commentary, in that those last words of David, Mashiach Lohei Yaakov, he says as follows. He says, Ruach Adonai diber bi, God speaks through me. Moshel Amar Lo Yisrael li diber tzor Yisrael Moshel ba'adam Sadik Moshel Yirat Elohim. God of Israel has said, you should, maybe one of reading this is, you should be a ruler over men. You should be a righteous king, essentially. And he notes as follows. He says, Ki lo chen beiti im el. My house, it's a little bit opaque what exactly the meaning here is, something along the lines of that his house is secure. Ki brit olam samli, because God has set up an internal covenant with me. And here's a really important line. Arucha vakol ushimura. It is entirely sort of set up and secured and fulfilled and shmura and secure. Everything's secure. And this is how he sort of speaks at the end of the book over here in Samuel 2. Note his usage of the word bakol. Vadonai beirachat Avram bakol. This is Fishbane's point, I think is very astute. Here it sounds like that David is echoing Abraham, that he is blessed bakol, that he is ending his life bakol, everything, bakol mikol kol, everything is secured and safe for him. This is the David at that point in the book. Of course, like I said, at the end of the book, he counts the people, and that doesn't go well. But eventually he repents, and then David, like Samuel, like Abraham, who bought a portion in the land. David buys a place, a threshing floor, which becomes the site of the temple itself. Right, so they're both at the end of their lives, making sure to purchase a sacred space in the sacred space of the land. And this is the David at the end of the book of Samuel. You open up the book of Kings, and here we have the screen in front of us, and this is the Haftorah. Okay, this is our Haftorah. Hamelech David Zakein ba bayamim. Right away, you see the analog or the parallel with what we just read in Chayei Sarah. Abraham Zakein ba bayamim. They are both old. Two portraits of elderly kings. Abraham, in a way, is the first. Is he king itself? Is he a king proper? Not like David, although he is sort of, put into relationship with the king of the kings of Sodom and the other countries, and also other cities, and of course Melech Shalem. But Abraham, in a way, is also a king in the sense of he is the beginning of a dynasty, the great dynasty of the forefathers of the Jewish people. So we have one king, and then we have the second king over here, Hamelech David Zakein ba bayamim. Now, if you're just reading the Abraham story, you'd expect it to say, V'Adonai beirach et David bakol, and God had blessed David with everything, especially if you read the end of what we just read in Shmuel Bet. But, and then David ends his life, Shmura, everything is successful, he has an heir. No, look at the story here, takes a dramatic turn. David is old, Vaychesuhu babigadim v'lo yicham lo. And he is covered with clothes. They cover him with clothes, the anonymous they, and yet he is not warm. JPS translates here, he's never felt warm. He's cold. He's old and cold. And he's being covered, and yet no warmth comes to him. So here is a David, unlike Abraham who, actually sired 6 more children at the end of his life. Abraham, who is orchestrating his succession. Here we have David, who is cold, covered in clothing, and yet is not warmed. As Rabbi Silber has pointed out, the clothing in these books of Samuel and Kings, but also I'd say also in Genesis, but I think about Joseph, for example, the clothing can sometimes function as a symbol, right, or a sign of royalty. So you could also read this as, and they're covering him with clothes. Remember that he ripped Saul's garment, right? He ripped Saul's beged when he sees him hiding. So he's covered with clothes, and yet he is not warmed. His position, his royal role, does not protect him, and in itself he remains cold within it, insecure. By Yomer Lo Avadav, and his servants say to him, remember the servant in our Parashah. In our Parashah, we have a servant as well, Eved Abraham. There, the directions go in one direction, from Abraham to his servant, and his servant carries him out. But here, in David's throne room, in David's court, at the end of David's life, when he is cold and old, we get the sense of frail, his servants are the ones who initiate. And that becomes important. His servants say to him, Yivakshu ladoni hamelech na'ara betula. Let my master look for himself a young betula, a young virgin, a young maiden, right? Not a young maiden from Abraham for his son Isaac, but the servants, it's reversal. The servants look for let us look for a young maiden for the king. V'amda lefnei hamelech utihilo sochenet v'shachva v'chekecha v'cham ladoni hamelech. Rather troubling. To wait upon, let them look for this woman, to this young virgin, to wait upon your majesty and be his attendant. Amda lifnei is a technical term for sort of serving royalty. Let her be his attendant. Let her lie in your bosom, and my lord the king will be warm. So they looked for a beautiful girl throughout the whole territory of Israel. This sounds a bit like another search for a beautiful maiden throughout the boundaries of the kingdom for a king. Does it remind anybody of another story?
Yeah, Esther.
Esther, yeah, I was thinking that also. Yeah, so this evokes for me as well the story of Achashverosh and Esther. And I think that'll become important. I'll try to come back to that in a bit, right? But this story of looking for this Na'ara, and they find Avishag HaShunamit. It's interesting, Shunam, we met Shunam last week in the Haftorah, by the way. Right? The Shunam was Isha Shunamit, who Elisha met, which is actually from later in the book of Kings. Here again, we hear of Shunam, this young maiden, Avishag HaShunamit, and they bring her to the king. V'hanara yafad ma'od, she's exceedingly beautiful. And she indeed is Tahila Melech Sochenet V'tishartehu, she is his attendant, she waits upon him. So she fulfills that part. V'hamelech lo yida'ah. But the king did not know her. Here they translate the king was not intimate with her. Right? It does sound like earlier in the text that the warmth would come from her lying in his bosom, that he should be with her. He should know her in the biblical sense. But as Rabbi Silber has pointed out, and this is, I think, also very important, is it that David doesn't know her merely in the sort of biblical sense, if you will, that he doesn't sleep with her? Or is it actually B'hamelech lo yida'ah, that the king doesn't even really know what's going on in his court? He doesn't actually know anything. And the reason that I stress that is for two reasons. One, unlike Abraham again, who in his twilight days or years is not only cognizant of what's occurring, and not only, by the way, does he know in the biblical sense a new wife and is frankly virile, right? Has 6 children. We have here a king. So not only do we have that contrast with this king who is cold and who is being cared for by his servant, I guess his going-ons are orchestrated by his servants, as opposed to him controlling the servants. And he does not know this Avishag, but maybe unlike David, he doesn't even know what's happening in general. That's one reason it's important. It's also important because we'll find in a moment, speaking of succession, that we find a moment of, I'd say, sort of contested or problematic attempts at succession. And there also it's not clear. It seems that David doesn't know, right? It says actually explicitly later on, David lo yada, will come to that. David didn't know what was happening. So maybe here as well, the reader, wonders backwards when it says, Melech lo yada, maybe the king didn't know, not only was he not intimate with her, as the translation here would have it, maybe he doesn't really know what's happening at all. The picture of David in his throne. Okay. Again, look how different this picture is in the end of David at the end of the book of Samuel, right? So maybe that's also why the book of Samuel ends where it does. It has it's sort of David's ending, part 1, and then David's ending part 2, and they're different experiences. Okay. V'Adoniah ben Chagit mitnaseh lemor. At this time, Adoniah ben Chagit. This is one of David's children. Adoniah ben Chagit is boasting. He's raising himself up, saying, Ani amloch, I will be king. Maybe he's saying, I am king in a way. After all, Ya'as lo rechav ufarashim b'chamishim shratzim lefanav. He provides himself with chariots and horses, and an escort of 50 runners, meaning he's setting himself up to be king. His father had never scolded him, saying, why did you do that? And why did his father never scold him, by the way? Well, let's read on the end of the verse and then interrogate that. V'gamhu tov toar ma'od. He was very beautiful, very handsome. V'oto yalda achar Avshalom. And he was born after Avshalom. Avshalom. If you remember, Avshalom, the son of David who would be king, who was not king. But perhaps David expected him to be king. And like Avshalom, he too sets himself up to be king with runners and escorts and is very handsome. And perhaps, therefore, we wonder, when David does not scold him, is it because David doesn't know what's happening? As it says later on, perhaps? Does David not know what Adoniah is doing? Or perhaps David does know and approves implicitly, or does not disapprove. Perhaps he actually hopes, maybe he expects that Adoniah should be, like Avshalom in potential, should be his heir. Let's just pause again and think about the Parashah. We see no evidence of Isaac attempting to usurp his father's role during his father's lifetime. If anything, he seems to be sort of quiet, be almost passive, I would say. The wife is sort of identified, by proxy, by the Eved Avram, for the sake of Isaac, and eventually he marries her, etc. That's the Isaac, the heir of Abraham in the story of our Parashah. Here we have an old king, feeble, old, perhaps not cognizant of what's happening, and his son, meanwhile, and maybe he doesn't even know about this, his son is already declaring, I am king. And he has conferred with, he spoke with, meaning he is with. He has recruited to his team the figures which you know from earlier in the stories, the general Yoav and the priest Eviatar, and they ya'azru acharei Adoniah, while others in the court Sadok HaKohen, Uviniyah, and the prophet Natan, who we know from the Bathsheba story, among other places. They do not go with Adonijah. Adonijah makes a feast by Ein Rogel. Ein Rogel is outside of Jerusalem. I'm actually going to share for a second. This is an image from 1857 of Ein Rogel. Okay, this sort of I suppose it's probably a Ma'ayan or such, like a stream or a spring outside of Jerusalem. And he makes a party there, right? A sacrificial feast, and he invites all of his fellow princes, and all of the king's avadim. Interestingly, here, this is actually Alex Israel has pointed out. I think if I'm quoting him correctly, here we see the avadim of the king coming to this little sort of coronation party, but Natan's not invited, and Biniyah's not invited. My daughter is about to turn 4, God willing, and we were just talking about her upcoming birthday party, and she told us which of her friends to invite. Invite this one, invite that one, invite that one. But she said, this one, I don't know we should invite because he tends to grab all the cake. So we told her, no, we'll make sure he doesn't grab the cake, and we're going to invite the whole gan with you. Okay, so we'll work that out. But this case is different. Right? Adonijah is doing something very different. This is not a 4-year-old party. This is a political grab. This is a self-coronation party, sort of, and he therefore knows who to invite and who not to invite. But note that he invites Avdei HaMelech, right? All these other Avdim HaLamelech. So the last time we heard of the Avadim of the Melech in this chapter was when the Avadim suggested to the king that they find for him this, beautiful maiden that shall warm him. Are these the self-same Avadim? And is their suggestion that he go out and find, they bring him this maiden, is that related to their actually siding with Adonijah? Interesting idea to consider. In any event, Natan says to Bathsheba, what a great book this is, the mother of Shlomo. Remember Bathsheba, who David encountered or saw upon the roof. I'm looking here over roofs in Jerusalem, actually, as I teach this. And he encountered Bathsheba and, has her husband killed. And eventually they have Shlomo, and he's to be king. We'll see about the he shall be king part. But Natan says there, Halo shamata ki malach Adonijah ben Chagit va'adonenu David lo yada. You see it again. But have you not heard Bathsheba, what Adonijah is doing? He's assumed the kingship, and David, our master, does not know. There's the not knowing David, and therefore what he says to her is, take my advice. Do as follows to save your life and the life of your son Shlomo. Apparently, if Adonijah is to be king, he might, kill all of his brothers or possible competitors. Go to David the king and say to him, didn't you promise that Shlomo v'nechim lo chacharai? Why has Adonijah become the king? Now, it's interesting. We don't know. Did David actually promise that or not? And note that in our Parashah, again, we have oaths being deployed in order to secure succession, right? David says to the Eved, swear, I'm going to forswear you, and you must agree to this oath and undertake to secure the succession in the following way. The Shvuah helps secure the succession. Here, it actually confuses the matter in a way, because, maybe he swore this, maybe he didn't. We don't really know, right? The reader, if he swore this, so it's clouded in a bit of mystery, and the oath. The claim of the oath, at least, rather than clarifying, actually makes the story more complex. But she says, you swore that Solomon would be the king, not Adonijah. And just as she's speaking, right, as she is to speak, Natan says, I will come while you're still speaking, Ani avo acharayich, I will come in and fill your words, right? This also reminds me, by the way, and I'll get back to this in just more in my second, the story, again, of the Megillah, Achashverosh, and Mordechai and Esther, when they sort of want to convince the king, and they have a ruse and a plan for, entering to the king's throne room, as it were, and they invite him to a banquet and to, reorganize the political alliances within the court, to identify Haman, he is the bad man, and you should save my people, etc. So this reminds me of that as well. So Bachoik does what he says. Hamelach zakein ma'od. The king is very old this time, not just old, but very old. Avishag Ashunwit is waiting upon him. It's interesting that she's there while Bathsheba comes in, and he says, "What's troubling you?" Right? Also sounds like Achashverosh, if you will, to Esther. And she says, because you swore to me that Solomon would be the king, but now Adoniah is sort of taking over the kingship. In fact, he actually has Malach, he actually become the king already, and you lo yadata. And he has, made this party, but he hasn't invited Solomon. So what should we do, right? Indeed, our lives are in danger because when you die, David, your sons and myself will be chata'im, will be regarded as traitors. Okay, so she's still speaking, and Nathan comes in, and he tells the same thing to the king, right? He says, actually, you must have said, O king, that Adoniah should be the king, because how else could he have done this, right? And yet he didn't invite me, right? How could you have done this and not told me? And David says, call in Bathsheba. I don't know that we know that she left, but call her in. She comes in, and David swears and says, Solomon shall be king. Says Bathsheba, she bows 7 times and says, Yechi Adonai HaMelech David le'olam. As Fishman says, kind of ironically, may the King David live forever, knowing, of course, that he's about to die, right? Long live the king is dead. Right? May the king live forever, but may he live forever indeed, knowing he can't, but it's a nice thing to say, but also may he live forever through secured succession. And the story continues on, where Adoniah finds out about this, but Solomon is anointed by the Gihon spring, closer right within Jerusalem, and he's anointed, and that is how he becomes the king, etc. So this is the basic story of the Haftorah. So it's a really dramatic narrative. I sort of recommend that you open the text itself and just pour yourself a nice drink and sit back and enjoy. It's just really intriguing. People have compared it to The Godfather. The Godfather epics in a way, or Godfather is compared to it for its drama and for its sort of meditation upon power and succession, peace and bloodshed. For our purposes here, let me pause. As I've been going, I've been trying to outline some of the comparisons and the contrasts with our Parashah, and I'll reiterate and then pause for your own ideas. But we've noted that these are 2 stories, differing depictions, parallel in a way, but that just highlights the differences, the different depictions of a founding monarch or founder of a dynasty, David and Abraham, respectively, at the end of their days, old Baba Yamin, but then total split, right? So here's Haftorah as countertext, I would say, not as sort of enhancement or embellishment of the story as is, but rather as alternate picture, okay, of a king at the end of his life. Abraham zakein babayim, David zakein babayim, but Abraham is blessed bakol, and through an oath secures succession for his dynasty, finds a wife for his son by virtue of instructing his loyal servant, and therefore trying to secure for himself the descendants who will be so numerous they're uncountable, like the stars in the sky. And in contrast, you have this David who just counted, by the way, so I would say at the end of Samuel, who just counted the people who are not supposed to be able to be counted. And he, however, is alone and cold and doesn't seem to know what's going on, whose servants instruct him rather than vice versa, who rather than marrying at the end of his life and having 6 children, is cold and they find a beautiful maiden, but nonetheless, lo yida'ah, he's not warmed and certainly doesn't have more children. And very importantly, or most importantly, there is among his sons contested succession, where one son declares himself apparently king. Is this the son that does David even know what's happening? Does he know and kind of approve, perhaps? Who knows what's going on with David at this point? But there's contested succession, The oath here is brought up not to clarify the directives, but complicates the story in a way. It's a claim that, it's a claim that the oath was issued, which should clarify things, but the reader doesn't even know if that even occurred to begin with. But David is manipulated. I mean, he is manipulated. I don't mean that in necessarily a critical way, but he's clearly manipulated by Natan and Bathsheba, right? They set up a scene, right? You go in, and then surprisingly, I'll appear all of a sudden, I, Natan, and I'll reinforce your words. And at the end, then David, secures Solomon as his heir. But is it him securing the heir with full cognizance, full capacity? Is that really his deepest wish? The reader has to wonder. Two very different depictions of succession, of sunsetting and sunrise. Two very different pictures of transition and transfer of power. Both deal with confrontation with mortality, but give very different depictions of aging. So let me pause there for a moment, and I want to open it up to your own, before we close our brief time together here, your own reflections, your own insights, perhaps your own questions or thoughts. Beth?
I don't think of David HaMelech as being mentally out of it. He's certainly isolated in his room because he's sick and cold and old.
Yeah.
But when Natan and Bathsheba speak to him, he rouses himself at the end of the Haftorah and makes a very positive declaration about what he wants to see happen. And he's out of it in the sense of being out of the loop while he's isolated in his bedroom. But he appears to me to still have intentionality and to still have his wits about him. I think you could say that maybe he was manipulated by Natan and Bathsheba, but if he had indeed vowed that her son would succeed him, and she reminds him, and he says, yes, that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, I think this is a totally plausible reading. I actually think the text is probably intentionally unclear here, intentionally ambiguous. One way of reading it is indeed David, maybe he's feeble and old and cold, but as you say, he's aware enough to know what's going on. And if he had indeed swore that Solomon identified Solomon as his heir, then he is able to rouse himself, and through the help and assistance of his loyal Bathsheba and Natan, is able to be, returned to his self and his sort of agency at the end, and see his wishes fulfilled. So that's definitely one way of reading what's happening here. At the same time, go ahead.
One thing I wanted to add.
Yeah.
Just because someone who's extremely elderly is physically feeble, that doesn't mean that they're not cognizant of what's going on and that they don't have their wits about them. I know this from my own family, from my two very elderly parents who died in the last 10 years. Their bodies failed, but their minds did not.
Absolutely, right. And remember, Abraham is also quite old and yet is fully in his wits. It's only the cues, the clues, perhaps, about David twice not knowing that make. It's not me, actually. I think Rabbi Silber has pointed this out, and others also pointed this out, that raise the question for the reader, raise a question for us of what he knows and doesn't know. But it's definitely not inevitable, or it's not sort of it's not inevitable or inherently, the state of being of someone whose body is old and frail, that their mind is therefore also. Yeah, that's why it's a question. Absolutely. We see in the chat that Aviva wrote, in both stories, the succession does not go to the oldest son. The succession upsets the natural order of succession and goes instead to the more suitable successor. Yeah, and that's a good point, and that is or the narrative's more suitable successor. And that is a common biblical trope, right? The choosing of the younger son over the older son happens. It's like a core staple of the narratives. Core staple of the narratives. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, just to the point that you raised up about, that you shared about your own experience with your parents, and I think that for many of us in the Shiur, maybe we have had our own experience with our own parents or others. Certainly people who anyone who's ever gotten to that life stage. To be sort of candid, I feel like I'm starting to get to that stage. Thankfully, my parents are very healthy, but getting to the life stage where the direction of care starting to turn, right, and when it's starting to take care of one's parents in a way. I mean, if they ever see this, they are alive and well and still caring for me, thank God. But there's an element of starting to look out for one's parents, and that intensifies as one gets older. And one thing this parsha certainly does, it's not only in the grand sort of covenantal level, but also just simply as human beings encountering the parsha and the Haftorah in life, it makes us ask questions about mortality, right? And it invites us to have at our mind's eye two very different pictures of aging. Just nothing deeper, but neither more simple than that. The two pictures of aging, two experiences of confronting mortality and everything that comes along with that. I mean, not all of us are establishing dynasties and being bearers of covenantal blessing and such. Certainly, maybe you guys are. I certainly am not. But are we all? It's to some degree or another more or less aware of our own mortality and the mortality of our own forebearers? Are we not, all of us, whether we have children or not, some part of us looking towards what will be after our own lives in this earth end, right? In the Bible, that's called succession, right? Succession and heirs and children, and that's a common, human thing. But whether or not we actually have biological children or not, that the issue of what will succeed us, right? What will live on? What will our legacy be? And will it be? And Rumel, I'll come to you just in 1 second. Will it happen with a sense of orderliness, bakol, and blessing and peace and orchestration and etc., or will it be sort of murky and unclear, right? And ambiguous and complicated and fractured? That's what I see, at least in one reading. I think it's actually there, no matter what however you read the David story here. So the two Haftorot being put together, they simply present us as those who are learning the two texts side by side with these two pictures of mortality, and they make us ask ourselves, right? What will my end look like? What do I want it to look like? What will be? And there's no answers here, and I'm not even sure that there is necessarily a moral lesson. Perhaps there is. Perhaps we're meant to ask, what did Abraham do right, as opposed to David? But I'm not so sure about that, to tell you the truth. I wouldn't want to, bank myself on that. It's just simply two stories of two individuals at the end of their lives. That's on the level of just like plain old human being. With regards to the other level of founders of biblical dynasties and, heirs to thrones and blessings, so that's a whole other level, which is going on here as, the blessings of David's family, of Abraham's family, and the blessing of David's dynasty have to find their way forward with these people. So let me take Rumel and then take Ruth, and then I'll have one final comment.
Well, I looked at it as a contrast, just in the types of lives that we lead, and all along the way, Abraham seemed to have things. He was always thinking ahead. for the succession and for the life of his children, and who was going to be surrounding him at the end, and what legacy he was going to leave.
Right.
So I agree with that. Not that David did anything wrong, but it's just a study in contrasts in two different lives. And that's what I was thinking about.
Okay, thank you. Ruth.
Right. So first, I just have a very small observation. It's just an echo, since you're listening to echoes in the story. When Bathsheba comes in, David says to her, Malach, which sounds awfully like when the Malach says to Hagar, Malach Hagar.
Very nice.
That just twinkled in my mind. I don't know what to do with it, but there's that. Right. But it's very abrupt, and there's no, he's like, it's very gruff. Like, what do you want? It seems that way. It could not be, but it could be. And the other is, we're left with the question, since there's nothing in the text. There's no testimony in the earlier story that David ever said anything to her about this. So, is she bamboozling him because he says, oh, well, if you said that I made a swear about this, I guess I did. So there is something indicating that he isn't really as sharp as he once was, because she can just say this to him and he says, oh, okay.
Right. That's so those are very good observations. I really appreciate all your observations. Thank you so much. I just want to say that regarding your latter point, that's exactly one way of reading the text. And I think Beth's reading is also plausible, and that she's reminding him, right, of the oath that he did, in fact. So that's the ambiguity. So well done, everybody. Your first point is really terrific, I think. As you were mentioning, so I looked it up, right? Malach Hagar in Genesis 21 says the angel to Hagar. And I hadn't thought of that. So as I'm on the spot thinking with you, what if the commonality is in both places? You have a mother who's concerned about, securing the future of her son, right?
Exactly.
And in that way, and there's something there. So thank you for that. I want to, Beth, I see your hand. So maybe what I'll do is I'll make one more comment, and then I'll hang on here, a little bit past the hour, and we can talk more. But I really appreciate everyone's building this together. What I want to just note is one more point. I mentioned a few times already that the possibilities. So again, I saw this somewhere with regards to Noah, the Parashah Noach Lech Lecha, the idea that the Haftorah is a segue of sorts. That one of the functions of the Haftorah is to get you from one Parsha to the other in a really interesting way. So what I had seen was the idea of Roni Akara Lo Yalada, sing O Akara, barren woman, being read after Noah, but before Lech Lecha, right, takes you from the stories of fertility into the story of infertility of Sarah. We mentioned other similar things last week, for example, last week as well, like the idea of the wife, the mother of the child in the story of Elisha, the Isha Hashunamit, and her active role and her care about her son, who could be sacrificed, as it were, who dies but then is resurrected, as anticipating by Yuchanei Chaye Sarah. Right, the Sarah's lack of role / role. I want to just note here a simple point to close, which is that this whole story of two partners sort of working out I'm not sure what word to use here, a ruse or a strategy or sorts to secure a succession around an aging father, reminds me a heck of a lot. Not only the story of Mordechai and Esther, which is a little different, but also next week's Parashah Toldot, and the story of the contested succession of Isaac, and the story of Rivka and Yaakov, again, a man and a woman, who are work out a way of securing the blessing from Isaac to Jacob as opposed to Esau. So I leave you with that little thought that once again, perhaps do we see a segue, the Haftorah, saying, here's the story of Abraham, and here's Abraham versus David, but sometimes it doesn't work out that way, right? Abraham, sometimes you get into Parashah Toldot, and then we have another segue. So that's one to leave here. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to hang on here because I want to learn with you a little bit more. And I think Noah looks like she has some just to wrap us up, perhaps some comments, and then I'll hang on. And it's really been a pleasure learning with you today. Look forward to seeing you next week.
So
Thank
just the
you.
usual. Thank you, everyone, for being here and participating in our learning community. It's always very rich when folks contribute and make it a real discussion. So as Dr. Kelsen mentioned, if you happen to be in Jerusalem or nearby, you can learn with Rabbi David Silber tonight at 8 p.m. Israel time. Eastern time isn't so pertinent to you if you're in Jerusalem, so I'll leave that off. But at the same time, if you aren't in Jerusalem, 1 p.m. Eastern, we do have a class with Rabbi Jonathan Deering on economics. It's always really wonderful learning with him. Feels like it gives you a whole semester class in a day, which is a lot, but very, very thorough. And 2:30 p.m. Eastern, we have Dr. Shana Strout-Schick. Her class has been absolutely fascinating. It's a comparative look at ideas about women's obligation in diaspora texts and Jerusalem community texts. And all of our educators have just been really great this season, which not uncommon. But to me, it feels like when you go to a museum and you get a really great guide, you might know one thing that you're looking for, but they point out all the little bits and pieces that really bring the story together. So I encourage you, even if you can't make it at that hour, we have recordings. If you can't, find the recording, reach out to our office, inquiry@drisha.org. We'll send it to you super quick so you can get caught up and enjoy all that we're offering. And we look forward to learning with you again as soon and as often as you're able to. So back to you, Dr. Kelsen.
Terrific. Thank you, Noah. And thanks once again for everything you do for this learning community. And all right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Beth, what did you want to say before Byron? See you next week, I hope.
One thing that occurred to me when Ruth was talking about the possibility that here David Melech is being bamboozled by Bathsheba, one thing to keep in mind is that long-term spouses will often be the memory repository for each other. Like, my husband will say, remember when and I have no recollection of it at all, but I trust the guy, so I believe what he's telling me. And there are times when I will remind what happened, and he believes me because he trusts me. So I'm just throwing that out, that we all have imperfect memories, and sometimes one's partner fills in the gaps for us.
Right.
So it isn't necessarily nefarious.
It's not at all necessarily. It's only possible.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're saying is very true and poignant. And I'll note I've been married only 6 years or so, and I also experience that quite often, where I forget everything and my wife reminds me. In terms of reminding David, I'll just say, Rabbi Silber, by the way, I listened to a Rabbi Silber teaching on this chapter on 929 English. If you go to 929 English, there's a whole series of little audio recordings that he made, chapter by chapter, which is a terrific resource. So I listened to that one, not on Haftorah, but on the chapter itself and within the context of the book. And when Bathsheba says to David, if Adonijah becomes king, then me and your son Shlomo will be, will be chata'im, right? So it's translated by JPS as traitors, but it also means kind of sinners, because Adonijah will see them as enemies, traitors, right? But Rabbi Silber says, it's interesting. Maybe that evokes their status as, their relation to sin. Remember that David sins, right, with Bathsheba, and actually he admits chatati la'Hashem, right? When Nathan himself confronts David, he says, to David's credit, at that point at least, it wasn't so creditful that he did it to begin with, but at least he said at the end, I sinned to God. So I wonder, as to your point, Beth, if she's also kind of reminding him, giving a little nudge, we'll be chata'im, remember who the chotei there was, David? Remember, honey? That was you. And that's why we are associated with chet around here. Anyway, By the way, the notion that the Davidic, the line of Judah, right, gets continued through some sort of illicit sexual activity goes back to Judah and Tamar, and David and Solomon continues that. that theme. Okay, thanks everybody. Looking forward to seeing you next week.
So
Thank you. Bye-bye.
thank you. Your last point about the chata, totally did not see that, but wow. Yes, the legitimacy of Shlomo and the whole marriage, the idea that it's still persisting because it gets swallowed up in Shmuel Bet. The story's over and it's over and everybody thinks, okay, yeah. But no, it still persisted. There's a persistence of question about the legitimacy of the whole thing. Like a reader 2,000 years later, I'm saying, well, wait a minute, didn't people always question this in the same way that they questioned David's legitimacy because he's his great-great-grandmother's a Moaviyah, and that lingered on forever. So yeah. And I like the way you segued into next week's Parashah, because the plotting between Rivka and Yaakov is not as simple or as innocent, I believe, that it, as it appears on the surface. So there's some kind of hint here too.
Yeah. Well, by the way, next week's Haftorah, then I get to sign off on next week's Haftorah. I think I'm not the first person to say this. Might contain a not so hidden critique of Jacob and his role. So we'll talk about that later.
Look forward to that. Okay.
All right. Have a
Thank
great
you so much.